From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Tim Walz's military record becomes a point of public debate as Kamala Harris's new VP pick introduces himself to the nation. Meantime, Donald Trump holds a meandering press conference in which he challenges his opponent to 3 presidential debates this fall, and another member of the squad, Congresswoman Cori Bush, loses a primary this week in Missouri. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell and columnist Kim Strassel. It's been a whirlwind week for Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, introduced on Tuesday as the Democratic choice for vice president. We've looked into some of his record as governor as well as his remarks at his first rally. But now let's examine one of the emerging criticisms of Walz, and that's related to his military career. Let's start with a clip of Donald Trump's choice for vice president, J.D. Vance, going after Walz in this vein.
You know what really bothers me about Tim Walz as a Marine who served his country in uniform? When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with. What bothers me about Tim Walz is the stolen valor garbage. Do not pretend to be something that you're not. And if he wants to criticize me for getting an Ivy League education, I'm proud of the fact that my mamaw supported me, that I was able to make something of myself. I'd be ashamed if I was him and I lied about my military service like he did.
Kate, how do you evaluate this public argument now over Tim Walz's military background?
Well, let's separate a couple of questions out. We're throwing around words like stolen valor. I think there are questions about his record here that we can go through, but it's a separate question whether it is a potent line of attack for Republicans to focus on these discrepancies. So here are the basic allegations against Walz. One is he, in a clip, says to support his stance on gun control, I'm paraphrasing, but we shouldn't be using weapons that I carried in war. He did not deploy to a war zone. He deployed in the early 2000s to Italy to help do base defense at the time after 9/11. He has styled himself as a retired command sergeant major. That is the highest enlisted rank in the National Guard. He did hold that rank for some length of time, but he did not finish the requirements for it, and so he retired actually as a master sergeant, which is an E8. And so he has represented this rank differently in how he's styled himself. The final issue is his retirement. He retired in the spring of 2005 to run for Congress. His unit that he had served in Minnesota was later in 2006 went on a year-long deployment to Iraq. And the accusation from some of his fellow unit mates has been that he retired to get out of going on the deployment. There have been some discrepancies. Well, did he know that they were deploying to Iraq? I think the unit wasn't formally notified they were going to Iraq, but having anybody who has kind of a background in how this works, it's unlikely he would have had no idea they were going to Iraq given how long the planning timetables are. And there's some evidence from his early run for Congress that he at least had some idea there was a potential deployment for his unit in the offing. That said, people retire for all sorts of reasons. He was at 24 years of service. And also just, lastly, the Army and the National Guard at the time were using this procedure called stop loss frequently during the early wars on terror to retain people past their retirement date or past their service time. So if the National Guard really needed him to go on this deployment, it didn't necessarily have to approve his retirement. So that is one question that I haven't gotten answered as well. If he was essential to the unit, why would the Guard just let him retire? So I think what we have here is he's played pretty fast and loose with kind of his description and describing himself perhaps as an Operation Enduring Freedom veteran, which most people think of as strictly confined to Afghanistan, though his service in Italy during the same time period is arguably characterizable as in support of that mission. I thought Peter Meyer, the former congressman from Michigan, described that well when he used the fast and loose term, and he didn't correct people who called him a combat veteran. He didn't scrupulously describe his service. I don't think that amounts to stolen valor. I think most of the public just simply doesn't have have a good impression of what the wars on terror actually looked like. A very small segment of society actually served in them. And so there is this misperception out there, and I think Walz allowed it to persist and could clear it up by apologizing for that now. But I don't quite buy it yet as stolen valor.
Kim, what's your take on this? The exact quote from Walz in 2018 when he's talking about gun control is, "We can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war is the only place where those weapons are at," unquote. And I understand the criticism that allows a misleading perception, but he didn't say he was in a combat zone. And if you are in the National Guard and you're overseas on a base, you probably have a service weapon with you. I'm not a veteran, so that's kind of just an assumption. He's carrying some kind of gun on the base. He has access to that kind of military hardware. And I'm just skeptical that this is a very productive line of attack more broadly. I mean, we have a volunteer army, volunteer military service. Only about 1% of the U.S. population serves in uniform. And here's a guy who spent 2 decades in the National Guard honorably and is being introduced in front of democratic, progressive crowds, and they're cheering for his military service. And so I'm skeptical that Republicans are going to get a lot of juice out of this line of attack on Walz.
I guess I'm where Kate is, and I would make the distinction between his actions and then later descriptions, as it were, or lack of clearing up some discrepancies about his record. On his actions, which is obviously the question of his retirement, as you say, he served for 24 years. By the way, he was in the National Guard since he was 17 years old, and that's just not something a lot of people in America can say. He gave his service and time to his country, and the retirement question, there are at least enough questions about who knew and when, and again, all these very complicated questions about why people retire. And I mean, his fellow guardsmen have a right to voice their own opinions on that, but I think it's thin gruel as an attack line politically. The descriptions part, I'm with Kate as well too. I'm not saying it's stolen valor, but there's something, and I think Kate mentioned Peter Meyer, the former congressman from Michigan. His description was more like shady, not stolen valor. And there is something, as a lot of people look, and vets in particular, they take this very seriously, their description of their rank, what they did, because they don't want to be accused and because they have so much respect for their colleagues who did partake in different activities sometimes than they did. And there is something very unsettling when people appear to use that biography, especially when you're in the world of acting for political gain. And so a lot of vets who serve in Congress are very, very scrupulous and careful about not just what they say, but also clearing it up if other people are misstating what they did or misusing their title. And there seems to be a general sloppiness on the behalf of Walz to not engage in that correction and at times allow people to think things that were not otherwise the case. That's not necessarily like a disqualifying issue, but it could well be something that some voters look at and they find unpleasant.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Meantime, Donald Trump held a press conference at Mar-a-Lago on Thursday, and the crux of the issue was that he said that he had accepted the terms for 3 debates coming up in coming weeks and challenging Kamala Harris to show up for those debates. As far as I've seen, she has said she will accept one of them, the one that was previously agreed between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But, Kate, it's heartening, I guess, that we have one debate and maybe more coming, because there are a lot of questions still, I think, about what Kamala Harris really believes, what kind of a president she would be. The Journal has an editorial today on her potential future role as mystery commander-in-chief, as it says. And can you give us a sense of what are the foreign policy questions, the unknowns about what a Kamala Harris presidency would look like?
Well, Kyle, there are a lot of them. She doesn't have a national security background from her past as, AG or California senator. So it's a pretty thin record. And she has been walking back a lot of what she did do in general via campaign statement. So we don't have a lot of insight. We have reason to think she would be less sympathetic to Israel than Biden has been. And this week there has been this story her advisors had to spend time cleaning up, that she was willing to discuss a possible arms embargo against Israel with an anti-Israel group. So they had to walk that back, which suggests perhaps She's less friendly to Israel than Biden is. She also skipped Netanyahu's speech to Congress. But we're also relying heavily on things she did years ago. In 2019, she said she would rejoin the Iran nuclear deal as long as Iran returned to compliance. Of course, that's the magic asterisk because Iran won't comply with the deal. She wants to associate herself a lot with the NATO reinvigoration that Biden claims from supporting Ukraine after its invasion. But we have no idea whether her strategy would be different from Biden's. And Biden's strategy has been just allow Ukraine to kind of hold out, to lose slowly, don't give them weapons that might actually help them regain some of the fifth of their country Russia is occupying. So we have no idea there how she would distinguish herself on Ukraine. And then, one really alarming thing is that she has said she unequivocally agrees with the goal of reducing the defense budget. That was a line that she gave in 2020 when she voted against a Bernie Sanders amendment in the Senate that wanted to cut the Pentagon by 10% and rededicated that funding to a bunch of domestic programs. Now, she could have simply voted no for that because it wasn't a serious amendment. 10% and an indiscriminate 10% would be enormous, but she really wanted to make sure that the progressives knew that she was very favorable to cutting the defense budget. Well, now that we've got wars on two continents, is that still the case? We have no idea. So these are just some of the issues where we don't know where she stands. We don't know what kind of commander-in-chief she would be, who she would necessarily surround herself with, aside from her current team of advisors, or how she might shake up Biden's cabinet. And so I think this really underscores, we've been talking a lot about in the press about how she's not giving any interviews. She's now said she promises to get around to this by the end of the month, but this kind of underscores what's at stake by her not telling us what she believes about anything. And it's good news that she's going to debate Trump, and Trump seems like increasingly the only opportunity to get her to answer even any questions about any of this.
But Donald Trump is, for his part, answering questions after that debate challenge that he issued. He took questions from the press there in his typical kind of rambling style, all sorts of matters. Here he is responding to a reporter's question on why he isn't out doing more campaign events.
What a stupid question this is.
Why haven't you been campaigning?
Because I'm leading by a lot and because I'm letting their convention go through. And I am campaigning a lot. I'm doing tremendous amounts of taping here. We have commercials that are at a level I don't think that anybody's ever done before. Plus, in certain cases, I see many of you in the room where I'm speaking to you on phones, I'm speaking to radio, I'm speaking to television. Television's coming over here. Excuse me, what are we doing right now? She's not doing any news conference. You know why she's not doing it? Because she can't do a news conference. She doesn't know how to do a news conference. She's not smart enough to do a news conference.
And here he is talking about the rally that he spoke to on January 6, 2021.
If you look at Martin Luther King, when he did his speech, his great speech, and you look at ours, same real estate, same everything, same number of people, if not, we had more. And they said he had 1 million people, but I had 25,000 people. But when you look at the exact same picture, and everything's the same because it was the fountains, the whole thing, all the way back to from Lincoln to Washington, and you look at it, and you look at the picture of his crowd, my crowd, we actually had more people.
Kim, maybe Trump is trying to make the case here that he is willing to come out and face the press and Kamala Harris isn't. But I wonder about the effectiveness of this being off message on all these different topics, talking about January 6th again. And he seems to think that he's still ahead, or at least that's what he says. But he's no longer leading in the Real Clear Politics average of the polls, which now has Kamala Harris up by 0.5 percentage point. And while he is still up in some of the swing state polling averages, some of those polling averages don't have new polls that have been entered in the month of August. So he's up by about 2 in Pennsylvania, for example. But the last poll there was July 30th. And so there's a lot of political water that is going under the bridge that is not reflected yet. I'm starting to wonder if President Trump is more like the underdog.
I don't know if I would go as far as to say that. We can talk about the polls in a second. Look, he was right to do this press conference because it appears to be a recognition that the press is forming ranks around Kamala Harris, and she does not intend to do any press conferences or interviews if she can get away with it. And part of that forming ranks is nonstop flattering attention on her. I mean, that question that you heard there, it was kind of a silly question in that it was simply taking the Kamala Harris narrative of this week. She had gone out and put a side-by-side of the campaign events that she was doing and how many she was doing versus how many he was doing. No, he has not had as many sort of rallies and appearance things, but there are different ways to campaign. So in doing this event, he was essentially saying, I'm going to have to take a different tack if I want to get myself back in the headlines, because the press left to its own devices is going to just shower Republicans with bad headlines and ignore what he is doing otherwise. The press conference, could it have been more disciplined? Absolutely. And one big test and question over the next week is whether or not Donald Trump will heed the kind of pleading by some of his advisors that he try to keep this campaign focused a little bit more on the issues. He seems to have heard that, and there are some press reports that he's now going to do that more aggressively. On the polling, I think if you step back, she obviously got a bump from all the good headlines that are coming back in this honeymoon period. But if you really step back and you take a look at the polls that are coming in, it looks as though what we've had is a return to the way the race looked a bit before Joe Biden had that debacle of a debate, which is it's very much looks tied up. Now, could that change? I think that if he doesn't successfully figure out a way to get on top of the narrative again and start making this campaign about her the past 4 years, if he continues to let her suggest that somehow she's the change candidate. I mean, think about that idea. We're changing from the current 4 years that she's just been in. It's nuts. So, if he can get the focus back again on her and her record and his policy proposals and his record, then I think he can arrest maybe some of this momentum.